So this session is the law of the kingdom. All right. So as Pastor has just mentioned, our first session was the gospel of the kingdom. All right. And then our second session was, I say second session. Our second session and topic was the king of the kingdom. So the logical transition now is the law of the kingdom. Okay. And I'll have you know that this will be a two-part session. So we was hoping that we would resume our usual communal activities from next Sunday, but this session is going to be two sessions. Okay, so we will resume here next week in similar fashion to continue this subject, because this is of the three that we've done. I don't really like making comparisons like this at times because everything in the Bible is important, but as Nikki would have pointed out last week, even when it comes to morality, there are weightier matters, all right, and lesser matters, all important matters, but there are weightier ones that are, have more weight, basically. So Scripture's the same. There are parts of the Bible that have more weight to it in the sense that it's very, very important that you get this right. Other things can be like, okay, but you get this wrong and it can have a significant detrimental effect on how you understand other things. And obviously, if our understandings are askew, then our actions will follow that same reality. That's the connection between what we believe and what we do. Okay, so two sessions, very important stuff today and in this session. So the law of the kingdom. So let's kind of build with this transition. So a kingdom must have a king. Okay, there is no sense of a kingdom without a king. I hope we realize that. Okay, there are different political systems, and a kingdom, all right, is one of them. You can have an empire and so on. All right, America is not a kingdom. All right, the UK is in some shape or form a kingdom in a very loose sense of the meaning, but there is no sense of a kingdom without a king, a queen, like a monarch. Okay, that is intrinsic to what it means to be in a kingdom or for a kingdom to exist. A kingdom must have a legal code. Okay, legislation. There must be rules and instructions, laws that govern that society. Okay, and govern the dominion of the king. So it's important that we remember from our first session that Yeshua's kingdom, the so-called kingdom, right, the kingdom of God, is the re-establishment of the ancient Davidic kingdom, okay? Otherwise known as the kingdom of God, all right? So when John the Baptist comes onto the scene, and Yeshua himself and the apostles in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, saying, repent for the kingdom is at hand, the understanding is the re-establishment of the ancient Davidic kingdom, okay? So the kingdom of God once existed before. It's not entirely new. The kingdom of God was once introduced into this world. So there were many kingdoms, all right, in the world at that time. But the difference between this kingdom and the other kingdoms was that the source of the authority of this kingdom was directly the creator himself, okay? Whereas every nation had its, whatever form of political system it had, king or pharaoh or whatever, and had its own legislation made by the people of that country. This kingdom got its legislation directly from the creator, okay? So therefore, it became the kingdom of God, okay? And then God would use an agent and a representative, and that would be the kings of Israel, to rule over that kingdom, all right? But the kings, as we'll see in the second, this was mentioned last week, the king of Israel did not legislate, right? In the sense that they did not create the laws of that land like other monarchs can and have, all right? They basically upheld the standard of that law and enforced the standard of God's law within that dominion and within that kingdom. So it's important to know this. The kingdom has been here before, okay? And it will be reestablished in its fullness, we believe, at the return of Yeshua. So the reestablishment of the Davidic kingdom is Yeshua's kingdom. So the question I want to ask, therefore, is what is the legal code of this kingdom? Okay, we know who we believe the king is Yeshua. It's the reestablishment of the Davidic Empire. Yeshua is the descendant of David. Okay, so what is the legal code of the Davidic kingdom? Can anybody tell me? I didn't hear so clearly. You're saying the Torah, the law. Can we be maybe a little bit more? Those are correct, generally speaking. A little bit more specific. Can anybody be a little bit specific? A little bit more specific? What was the legislation? Can we think of another name maybe that the legislation would have been referred to as in the Bible? Commandments too, that is, yeah, someone said the commandments is also correct. Statutes, that's there too. I'm looking for something else. And it's a term that will differentiate it from other legal codes. There you go. All right, the Mosaic law, the law of Moses. So the law of Moses, that terminology helps us to understand that this law came through, as we see in the biblical narrative, came from God, but through Moses, and therefore it's not the law of Pharaoh, or the law of another king or so on. It's the Mosaic law, the law which God gave to the Israelites through Moses. Okay, so there we have it. Okay, the law of Moses, the Mosaic law, the law of God as well, the law of Messiah, okay, i.e. the law, the legislation, the instructions that were given at Mount Sinai. Okay, and as someone else over here pointed out, the commandments. Okay, we're going to look at this today. What is the law of the kingdom, and just remind ourselves and clarify and solidify, if I might say, the nature of the law of the kingdom, how we ought to understand it. Okay, so if we believe that Yeshua is the Messiah, and I'm assuming that all of us here do, all right, we believe Yeshua is the Messiah. If we believe that Yeshua is the Messiah, if we believe he is the Christ, then we are basically declaring with that confession that Yeshua is the promised King of Israel. We are declaring that Yeshua is the rightful heir to King David's throne, as predicted by the prophets of Israel. That's what it means to confess that anybody is the Messiah. All right? If you're saying anybody is the Messiah, then you are declaring that that person, and we believe that person to be Yeshua of Nazareth, we're declaring that that person is the promised King of Israel, the rightful heir to King David's throne, as predicted by the prophets of Israel. Okay? And as such, Yeshua, as the King of Israel, Yeshua is bound to the law of David's kingdom, which is the law that God gave to Israel through Moses at Mount Sinai. And as I just mentioned earlier, and Nikki went there last week in one of the passages, the King of Israel is required to uphold the law of Moses with utmost integrity and with unwavering commitment. So let's bring up this passage here in Deuteronomy. I hope we can all see this. If you can't see it, the passage in view is Deuteronomy chapter 17, verses 18 to 20. Okay? Let's also remind ourselves when this was. So Deuteronomy, this episode here, is recording an account whereby Moses is delivering a set of sermons, if I might call it, to the Israelites in the wilderness before they are about to enter the promised land. And we're talking about the second generation. I was just watching Prince of Egypt, or the back end of it, the Prince of Egypt with my nieces and nephew yesterday. I've watched it several times, and I really like when they watch it. And I used it as an opportunity to have a little biblical history lesson, which I think they found quite quite insightful. So, as you guys remember, children, that the children of Israel, the Hebrews, the Israelites, were in bondage in Egypt under Pharaoh. Through Moses, through God, they were delivered, taken to Mount Sinai. But the first generation that came out didn't make it into the promised land. The second generation did go through with Joshua. So this is this time. All right. So Moses is rehearsing information that he had already delivered to the first generation as a part of their whole covenantal agreement that they have, this nation has with God. All right. So let's read it. Deuteronomy chapter 17 from verse 18 says this. Now it shall come about when he sits on the throne of his kingdom that he shall write for himself a copy of this law. This law. All right, on a scroll in the presence of the Levitical priests. It shall be with him, and he shall read it all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear the Lord his God by carefully observing all the words of this law and these statutes, that his heart may not be lifted up above his countrymen, and that he may not turn aside from the commandment to the right or the left, so that he and his sons may continue long in his kingdom in the midst of Israel. Okay, so and there's that bullet point there. So the law of the king of Israel and of his kingdom, the law of the king or the kings of Israel, is the law of Moses. I emphasized it for you. It's this law. So Moses is saying this law that he is, re-emphasizing in their presence in that moment. Okay, the set of instructions given at Mount Sinai. Now, this is why there is no such thing as a Messiah that abolishes the law. When we've read it, when we've gone through the Bible like this, from beginning to the end, following the biblical narrative and really following the story as the covenants are given and so on, and we come to passages like this, it's impossible to accept the notion that the Messiah abolished the law or that in some shape of the matter, certain instructions are rendered redundant or obsolete through the Messiah's teaching. If the Messiah is the King of Israel, here you go. They are required to uphold the law and the legislation of the kingdom with utmost integrity. All right? They're required to, and we'll get back to this later, they're required to write out their own personal copy of the law. Okay? And this is one of, some people ask me in some of the classes that I've done, why don't the Jewish people accept Jesus as the Messiah? There's several reasons. This is one of them. There is no, any Torah observant Jew, they've got the same Old Testament that we have, that's their Bible. Any Torah observant Jew, any biblically trained Jew, educated Jew, in the verses of the Torah, the verses of the Old Testament, the Tanakh, the scriptures, is not going to accept anybody who claims to be, or people who suggest someone is the Messiah, who themselves, through their teaching or their actions, render the law of Moses obsolete. They won't accept it, okay? But the reality is that for the most part, Christian theology and Christian teaching throughout the centuries, and still today is very prevalent. It's actually part of the foundation of Christian teaching. Okay, it's what kind of defines it as Christianity. And one of those theological perspectives is that through the Messiah's death and resurrection, these things in the Old Testament, these instructions are rendered obsolete. All right? Which can't be true. It's a big old contradiction. Doesn't make any sense. Okay? I don't believe that's the case. And as we already know in Matthew 5:17, Yeshua says, do not think that I came to abolish the law. I didn't do that at all. Right? And these things will continue to be valid and have authority until there's a new universe, until this heaven and earth passes away. And anybody who instructs someone to even disobey the least of these commandments shall be called the least in the kingdom. That's my king. That's my king. I can get with that king. Okay? I can get with a king that has integrity with the legislation of their land. I will rally behind that person. Right? We could look at Dominic Cummings and Boris and all these individuals who themselves are not great representatives of the constitution of their country. Okay, not so with Yeshua, if you understand him this way. All right. Okay, let's move on. But the main point is that we was asking ourselves, what is the law of Yeshua's kingdom? And why is this important? Because if we are claiming to be citizens of that kingdom, then we too are accountable to the legislation within that kingdom. Okay? And please don't look at legislation as a bad thing. Legislation is good, it's important. Imagine being in any organization where there is kamikaze and there are no rules. What do we get? Chaos and anarchy. Okay? We don't want that. Okay? All right, let's move on. All right, so that's the Mosaic law. We'll come back to that in a second. So before we move on into the Mosaic law, to the law of Moses, it's important that we understand that prior to the Mosaic law being given to the Israelites, there was already a universal legal standard in place. Okay, I'll say that again. Before the Mosaic law was given to the Israelites in Exodus and so on, there was already a universal legal standard in place. All right, now what we're getting into here is not new for us in the sense that I've already shared it on a few occasions here in recent years, but it is new for us as a community because it's not the theological perspectives and understandings that we held to before, okay? And this is going to be very important for us going forward, okay? So let's talk about this legal standard that was already in place, all right? Judaism refers to this universal legal standard and set of instructions as the Noahide laws, or the laws of Noah. Now, let me just ask a simple question, just to show you, this is Judaism. This is not what Christianity generally teaches, but it's in the Bible, and Yeshua and the apostles did know this. Okay, so whoever's grown up in church circles and whoever's been in church for a very long time, did you ever really hear much about the laws of Noah? No. Okay, I didn't. You hear about the Noah story, but you don't hear about the laws of Noah. All right, but Judaism, all right, has been teaching this for a very long time. And it's very, very important to understand. Okay? So dating back to the time of the apostles, Judaism taught that there is a universal standard of morality that God holds all people and all nations accountable to. All right, and the basic rationale is this. If God can and does judge and commend the nations for their behaviors and actions, then there must be a moral standard by which he assesses them and holds them to account. Right? If such is not the case, if there isn't a universal standard of morality in place, then when God judges a nation, it's not just. Okay? This is the perspective of the ancient rabbis, all right, from centuries, from the time of Yeshua. Remember, Yeshua went to the synagogue listening to these same rabbis. All right, so let me say that another way. We see an example. Noah's generation there was a flood in Noah's generation, right? And I think we all know that was an act of judgment in response to the waning morality and moral standards of his generation. Subsequent to that, Tower of Babel, another form of judgment is expressed there. We see this also in the Sodom and Gomorrah. Egypt is also judged as well. We also see other nations. So there was a moment when Nineveh, isn't you know the story of Jonah? Jonah and Nineveh, these were not Israelites, okay? They were from, on the eastern side of the Middle East, towards, Iraq and those areas there, Syria, Iraq, that region. They weren't Jews. They weren't Israelites. They weren't part of the nation of Israel. And God was going to judge them for their deeds. But graciously, he sends a prophet of Israel to go to that region, to leave the land of Israel, go to that region and to warn them. And if you don't know the story, read the story. If you know the story, then you know that God relents from his punishment. Okay? So God does and has either commended or judges individuals from the nations or the nations themselves. And if he does, there must be, if he's a just God, there must be a universal standard of morality that's in place. Am I making sense? Okay. Okay. So the ancient rabbis, therefore, taught that God communicated this universal standard of morality, these commandments and instructions, to Noah and his sons. And the commandments are as follows: not to worship idols, not to curse God, not to commit blasphemy, not to commit murder, not to commit sexual immorality, not to steal, not to eat flesh torn from a living animal, and to establish courts of justice. Okay? So these are the 7 laws of Noah. This is basic teaching in Judaism, by the way. And I say that again. Am I saying that that's basic teaching of Judaism? Because we've already ascertained that this is what Yeshua practiced. Yeshua knows this. Yeshua knew this. The apostles knew this. And next week we're going to see how more of this becomes directly relevant and important for us to know in the stuff we will look at next week. But it will also be very helpful today. Okay, so the 7 laws of Noah, the 7 Noahide laws. Okay? So once again, not to worship idols, not to curse God, not to commit murder, not to commit sexual immorality, not to steal, not to eat flesh torn from a living animal, and to establish courts of justice. Okay? So a few of these laws are explicitly mentioned in Genesis chapter 9. Bethany, if you can get that ready for us. If not, we'll turn there ourselves manually. Okay, so a few of these laws are explicitly mentioned for us, and recorded in Genesis 9. The rest of them that are not are logically derived from other parts of the scriptures where God is found denouncing the practices of the nations. Okay, so let's have a read of Genesis 9 from verse 1. All right, so remember, this is the early part of human history. This is before. There's no such thing as a Jew at this time. It doesn't exist. There are no Israelites. There are people, all right, well, at the moment, just 8 or so, all right, Noah and his family. Okay, so there's no such thing as a Jew, just Noah and his sons. They've just come out of the ark, okay? And God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. The fear of you and the terror of you will be on every beast of the earth and on every bird of the sky, with everything that creeps on the ground and all the fish of the sea. Into your hand they are given. Every moving thing that is alive shall be food for you." That's kind of new. "I give all to you as I gave the green plant. Only you shall not eat flesh with its life, that is its blood. Surely I will require your lifeblood. From every beast I will require it. And from every man's brother I will require the life of man. Whoever sheds man's blood, by man his blood shall be shed. For in the image of God he made man. As for you, be fruitful and multiply, populate the earth abundantly and multiply in it." Then God spoke to Noah, to his sons with him, saying, "Now behold, I myself do establish my covenant with you and with your descendants after you." Okay, we'll just leave it there. Okay, and I want to start with this sentence here. "Now behold, I myself do establish my covenant with you and with your descendants after you." I think many Bible readers are familiar with the aspect of the covenant made with Noah pertaining to the promise that God would never flood the earth again like he did in Noah's day. Okay, that is part of the agreement, but there were also stipulations for Noah and his descendants to also carry out. Okay, which is very often neglected because that's the reality. The covenant is a two-way agreement. God said, "This is what I'm going to do. This is what I'm require for you to do." And we just read those requirements earlier. So notice this covenant is between who? God and Noah's descendants. Okay, and if you didn't know, every person that has ever existed since the time of Noah is a descendant of Noah. Every single person. We are all descendants of Noah. Every single one of us. Okay, through one or more of Noah's sons and their wives. All right. So the first thing I want us to recognize is that if we can go back to the slide. Cool. If you can activate it for me. Cool. Thank you. All right. So the first thing I want to recognize is that these stipulations are incumbent upon all of Noah's descendants. Okay, to you and to your sons, to your descendants. Okay, are we clear on that? Okay. So we all benefit from God's promise that he will not flood the world again. That's a promise to all of us. Yes? Yeah. At the same time, the stipulations that he made, the laws of Noah, are incumbent upon all of us. It works both ways. Okay. So in the passage that we just read, God legislates that murder should now be viewed and treated as a capital crime, which basically means that the act of murder now warrants the death penalty. Okay? That was, I don't want to say an innovation, but that was new. Up until this time, it didn't warrant the death penalty. Okay? In fact, does anybody remember that Cain, after he killed Abel, did Cain become liable to the death penalty? Is it Cain? Yeah. Did Cain become liable to the death penalty? No. What actually was the case? Right. A mark was put on him. All right. Anyway, a mark was put on him. And the idea is that if anybody would kill Cain, there would be disastrous consequences. Yeah? Okay. And then later on, another dude pops up on the scene, Lamech, and he kind of misinterprets this whole situation, and he ends up killing some individuals. He's like, well, I've killed more than Cain, so if I've killed more people than Cain, then I'm gonna get even more protection from God, etc., etc. And then things escalate to what we find with God's judgment of the flood, so to speak. So a response to that after the flood is, all right, do you know what? You guys need to know this. Life is sacred. Man is made in the image of God. All right? So if anyone takes a human being's life, then that warrants the death penalty. No more protection like Cain like that. That's not happening. Does that make some sense? Okay? So murder is therefore explicitly communicated in that passage as illegal and therefore a moral wrong. Are you with me? Okay. But another important part of this passage is the statement, whoever sheds man's blood, by man his blood shall be shed. Okay? Now this is one of the many verses that really made me appreciate the wisdom of the rabbis, because I believe I have to tell you guys, the wisdom that the rabbis have and have accumulated over the millennia since they've been given the Torah is on a different level. It's on a complete different level to general things I've heard. There's good teaching in the Christian world, but the teaching of the rabbis. I mean, at the end of the day, I remember a friend of mine said this. He said, well, they have had it 2,000 years longer. And on top of that, they've actually lived it and practiced it and been chucked out of the land and lived it in exile and come back into the land again and lived it again and then sent back into exile again with the Romans till this day. They have both the time and the experience. with the Torah in a way that no one else has. Okay, and that's why it says that the law will go forth from Zion, and why the nations will say, let us go up to Jerusalem so that we may be taught. And why also God says to Abraham, through your descendants, the nations will be blessed. Okay? God has given them much wisdom in the rabbis. Okay? And throughout the course of our teachings here, we will be making reference to that. And I already have in like the Sabbath teachings that I did earlier this year. All right? But we've barely scratched the surface. Okay? We're going to get into the world. Jesus is a rabbi, no? All right? And he grew up listening to rabbis, of which, thankfully, the teachings of those rabbis are still recorded. We still have them. So we can actually listen. We can go and read, and we must, the teachings that Yeshua grew up with. All right? It was an assumption of Yeshua and the apostles that people would know this. But because of the historical divide of the followers of Jesus from the roots of their faith and the community of Israel, we've been very much locked away from the wisdom that comes through the teaching of the rabbis. Are you still with me? Okay. So as I was just saying, let me just bring it back a little bit. This is one of those verses that really made me appreciate the wisdom of the rabbis. Right? So from ancient times, right, dating back to Yeshua, and even before Yeshua was born as well, actually, like back to like Ezra and all them times there and before, the rabbis who studied the Torah, the teachers of the Torah teachers of Israel, they brilliantly pointed out that in this verse, God was establishing the principle of earthly government. Right? Whoever sheds man's blood, by who? By man shall his blood be shed. Okay? So the rabbis pointed out that in this verse, God was establishing the principle of earthly government. And this is essentially the moment that civil law was created, with God delegating some of his authority to human beings. You need to hear that. This is the moment where we see explicitly that God delegates his authority to human beings. Okay? But not only this, in terms of the wisdom of the rabbis, these same rabbis and scribes also came to the conclusion that if God turned over to human beings the extremely serious matter of determining capital punishment, the right to take human life, then certainly, by extension, lesser matters of life, such as authority over wives, children, servants, property, and land, etc., was also now in man's hands to legislate. Does that make sense? Right? If God's saying, look, you need to make judicial decisions governing the death penalty, whether someone's life is going to be taken, and that's like as serious as it gets. Right? If God is saying, I'm not going to do this, like this is, I'm authorizing you to now do this, and to take control of this in your society, then how much even more so for them to legislate on lesser matters of civil interaction. Okay? So, as I was saying, or I'll go on to say, therefore Judaism has taught from early centuries that through that the nations must establish and create courts of justice, one, and two, they must be accountable to courts of justice. Are you with me? Okay. This is one of the laws of Noah, to establish courts of justice. All right. So it's one of the laws of Noah, and it's a moral legal requirement that God holds all human beings accountable to. As I said before, this is the type of teaching that Yeshua and the apostles grew up learning. They knew that Gentiles, the nations, the idolaters out there in the foreign countries, that they were accountable to this standard. All right. And this is also the very reason why the apostle Paul taught the Gentile disciples in Rome, in the letter to the Romans, all right, to stay accountable to their local and national authorities. This is in like Romans chapter 12, where Paul says that, whatever authority there is, it's authorized by God, right? Paul's a Pharisee. Paul's a Pharisee. He's not just a Pharisee. He was like, according to his own personal testimony, he was the most educated upcoming Pharisee in Israel in his day and time. He was like the leading student within the Pharisaical sect. All right? Paul, don't mess about with Paul. Okay? But Paul, therefore, is well versed in the concept of the 7 Noahide laws. All right? And therefore, it's of no surprise, therefore, and we'll look at this next week, why Paul was chosen to be the apostle to the Gentiles. All right? He was the apostle to the Gentiles in a way in which the other apostles were not. Okay? So it's all very important stuff. You guys still with me? Okay. So this is a very basic moral teaching in Judaism that is understood to be applicable to all descendants of Noah, i.e. every single human being. All right? So every single human being is accountable to in their nations and in their societies to the commandment of establishing law courts. If there's not one in your society, it needs to be established. God will hold you accountable to that. And also the citizens need to be held accountable to that court of justice. This goes all the way back to the time of Noah. Okay, so let's tie this section up and get back to my main point, all right, which is that before God gave his law to Israel, all right, there was already a universal moral standard. There was already a universal moral standard that was communicated in earlier generations, right? And as I said, Judaism refers to that as the laws of Noah. And those laws, by the way, that we looked at are 7 categorical laws, all right? Those 7 laws have stipulations underneath them that specify more things about what's involved in blasphemy, idolatry, establishing courts of justice, and so on and so much. It's not just the 7. Those are just 7 categories of law, okay? 7 categories of law that are applicable to all people in every time and every place. And I cannot stress how important that is. Yes? Okie dokie. All right. With that said and done, where am I? Okay. Okay. You might be thinking, oh, we've done a bit of a detour. But it's important I did that first before we go into this. All right? The Mosaic law. Okay? This is the law of the kingdom, no? Okay, the law of the king of Israel. Okay, so the Mosaic law. The Mosaic law was delivered several hundreds of years later after the laws of Noah. And what's important to understand about that is that the law of Moses was not communicated to and decreed for all of the descendants of Noah. This is where, it's at this juncture where the general Christian teaching goes flat, okay, in this regards. Okay, it's very important to understand this. So once again, several centuries later, the Mosaic law is introduced, but it was not communicated to and decreed for all of the descendants of Noah. In fact, the Bible is clear that the law of Moses was given to, not the sons of Noah, but who? The sons of Israel. Okay? Before the law of Moses was delivered at the time of the Exodus of Egypt, the nation of Israel were accountable to the laws of Noah along with everybody else. I need you to get that. Are the descendants of Israel also descendants of Noah? Yeah. Right. Okay. So the Jewish people, the Jewish nation, the Israelites, they're all descendants of Noah too. So before the Mosaic law was introduced, they were already accountable to the laws of Noah that God holds all peoples accountable to. Does that make sense? Okay. However, at at Mount Sinai, God offered a covenant to Israel, which included an additional volume of commandments specific to them. Yes? All right, so that's the idea. That's the progression of the story. Okay, so at Mount Sinai, God enters into a covenant relationship with the Israelites, which included an additional body of commandments and instructions that were specific to them. All right, so we're going to look at, where am I? Sorry. Yes, no, actually, no. A little bit more to say. So the law of Moses then contains a repetition of the laws of Noah. All right? Of course. Pastor says, of course. All right? The 7 laws of Noah are in the laws of Moses. Why? Because they're still sons of Noah. Okay, so you'll find them in there. Idolatry is mentioned. Blasphemy is mentioned. Sexual immorality is mentioned. It's all there. Okay? It's all still there. That's all there. Read through Exodus, Numbers, Leviticus. You will find all of those categories in the Mosaic law. Okay? But what you'll also find are additional, all right, an additional 600 or so laws specific to the Jewish nation, making up now 613 laws in total. So therefore, the one Torah, Genesis to Deuteronomy, contains both the laws of Noah and the laws of Moses, making all human beings accountable to God's Torah. So when Isaiah says, it says law in Isaiah chapter 2, but the word in Hebrew is Torah, all right? It says the Torah will go forth from Zion, all right? That's for everybody. The Torah is for everybody, all right? But there are different instructions within that same one Torah. Am I making some sense? All right? So similarly, the law of Moses, all right, which is the law of the kingdom, contains the 7 universal laws of Noah applicable to everybody, and it also contains the rest of God's law that applies specifically to the Jewish people. All right? I'm being very repetitive here because it's important. So the additional 600 or so commandments involve instructions concerning things like prohibited work on the Sabbath day, sabbatical years, which is to allow the land to rest from agricultural work and activities, to not plow or to harvest for a year, and so on. All right, dietary restrictions, what the Jewish people refer to as a kosher diet, kosher laws. All right, what's allowed to be eaten, what's not allowed to be eaten. Observances of God's appointed times, such as things such as Passover and Rosh Hashanah, the different biblical festivals and feast days. The Jubilee years, which is every, is it 50 years or is it 70? Every 50 years when the servants in that country are allowed to go free. And when they leave, if they started last year and the Jubilee years this year, that's it, bound, you're free. And in the Torah, when you are emancipated and you cease to be a servant and a slave, you're supposed to go with possessions. Yes, but you can't go empty-handed. The master's supposed to give you some stuff, some clothes, some items, and all those. But if he's got children and wife, they go free too. Now that doesn't sound like the transatlantic African slave trade, does it? Right. So people hear slavery, and they think of the transatlantic African slave trade, and that informs how they think slavery is in the Torah. It's not completely different. But I'm not getting into that today, but we will. We'll get into it. Oh yeah, we do. Because there's many people within our community that love to wave that one. That's how the Christianity came over to West Africa. It's true. But God didn't condone that sort of slavery. No way. And anyways, don't get me started on that. Don't even. But we will. That's another one of those things. We're ready. I'm ready. I'm telling you. But as a side statement, like, I'm grateful to have the opportunity to do this, But as I said before, I've done this stuff already. There's so much more to do. There's a lot to learn. There's a lot to do, and there's a lot to be. All those three things. There's more for us to learn, there's more for us to do, and there's more for us to grow to be. I can tell you, we are all not here the best version of ourselves that we can be before we leave this planet or before Yeshua returns. And that's the call to discipleship. And that's what we want to help, and that's what we want to nurture, and that's what we want to provide, and that's what we want to use to infect the rest of the world in the most positive sense, all right, of influence. Right, but we need to get these core foundation details down so that we can move on into that stuff, because I really want to get into that kind of stuff. Okay, let me finish this. So the additional 600 and so commandments, which build on the 7 laws of Noah, deal with those things that I just mentioned: dietary restrictions, the Jubilee years, ritual purity, such as clean and unclean, and access to the temple and all that kind of stuff. And other stuff that were not instructed to all of Noah's descendants. Okay? And think about this now. And this is why, while we do see in the Bible, and still even today and in history, God judging nations. This is why we do see God judging nations in the Bible. You never ever see God judging Egypt, Sodom and Gomorrah, Noah's flood, Nineveh, Rome, or any other country that existed or currently exists. You will never see God judging the nations for failing to keep the Sabbath day. He never judges them for eating seafood, prawns, scampi, lobster, all right? That's part of, in the Mosaic law, that it says that the sons of Israel are not allowed to eat. But God never judges the nations because they ate lobster. All right? Nor does he judge them for failing to keep the Passover. Nor does he judge them for not allowing the lands and the fields of their countries to rest from agricultural work. Why not? Why doesn't God judge the nations for those things? Because the nations were not commanded to adhere to those things. God never entered into an agreement or to a contract with the nations or their ancestors, obligating them to these things. God did enter into a covenant with our ancestors, Noah, regarding things, which we're mentioning today, the 7 laws of Noah. But God never entered into a covenant with our ancestors. God never entered into a covenant or a contract or an agreement with any other nation or ancestors concerning those particular things that we have just discussed. Am I making some sense? Okay. Okay, so as I was just saying, there is no contractual responsibility for the nations regarding those things: Sabbath day, kosher food, etc. And rightfully so, because God does not hold them accountable to the additional body of instructions in the law of Moses. But God does hold, and I want you to understand this, God does hold nations and individuals from the nations accountable to idolatry, blasphemy, murder, theft, sexual immorality, the establishment and accountability of courts of justice, and from eating the meat from an animal that is still alive, which is basically to say God holds the nations accountable to their ethical treatment of animals as well. Am I making some sense? Okay. So that moves us on to our last little section, which shouldn't take too long. Differentiated obligation. Let me hear everybody say that. Differentiated obligation. Okay, what do we mean by differentiated obligation? This is a term I'll be using again and again and again here. It's very important we get our heads around it. I might say it in different ways, but this is one of the main ways we will refer to it here. So a differentiated obligation is the idea that there's one Torah, all right? One Torah, Genesis to Deuteronomy, and the prophets which build on that wisdom. Okay, there's nothing new, just further insight, explanation on what's already revealed in the Torah. So one Torah, therefore, one objective standard of morality, one objective standard of right and wrong from God's divine perspective, yet that one objective standard of morality applies differently to different categories of people. Okay, once again, differentiated obligation is the idea that there's one Torah, there is one objective standard of morality for the whole world, but yet that one objective standard of morality applies differently to different categories of people. So in a nutshell, in religious terminology, we're talking about righteousness and sin. Are we all aware, I hope we've gotten this, I hope this isn't an assumption that I've made, I hope we're all aware that righteousness, to do good, virtues, good morals, and sin, which is to do wrong, immorality, vices, that those things are defined by God's commandments. Yeah? Anytime we must be careful that we do not fall prey to assuming a higher level of authority than what God has issued. And this is what happens if you say that parts of God's law has been nullified, then there's going to be a vacuum which must needs be filled. And what's it filled by? Your denomination, or your own subjective experience or perspective on what you think is right and wrong, or in some particular terminology, how the Spirit leads me. It's true. The Spirit, etc., etc. No, that's not the reality. The Apostle John, I haven't got the scripture today, but it's in 1 John. The Apostle John in that epistle says, and I like the King James translation of it because it's very succinct. He says that sin is the transgression of the law. Simply put, Paul says in Romans, through the law came the knowledge of sin. If I did not know the law, I wouldn't know what sin was. Okay? So for us as disciples of Yeshua, who attach ourselves to his kingdom, we are first confessing that there is a creator of which our king worshipped, all right, and served, who gave a law to the king, to the Jewish people, which contains instructions for the entire world. Am I making some sense? Okay, so therefore for us, morality is objective. It's objective. It's not subjective. It's not based on what you think. There's a standard. And I like that because then when I have conversations with people, people, you're being self-righteous. Well, no, I ain't, because it's not my standard that I'm holding you accountable to. It's God's. All right? But here's another thing as well where the church has kind of gotten a bit wrong. All right? And this is probably from our, historical connections with Roman Catholicism and so on so much, where state and, religion become mixed, essentially. Notice how the Jewish people do their thing. Notice they're in their communities keeping the Torah, in their countries respecting the law of their land to the certain degree that they do, as long as it doesn't contradict, their or impede on their loyalty to God. But they're not trying to enforce the rest of the country to keep their moral commandments. You don't see that. You don't see that. But in the Christian world, we require everybody to be accountable to the Christian standard, whatever that is. But that's not the perspective of God. It's no way is that even going to work with various different nations and stuff all around the world, and our peculiarities and our complexities, and so on so much. All right? So there's Jewish people, and if you don't know, there are Jewish people who know, and they see it as their responsibility to help the nations become aware of their accountability to the laws of Noah, and therefore their accountability to the Creator. But they would never, in a moment, say to them, you're a sinner if you don't circumcise your sons, or if you don't keep a kosher diet. They know that's not for everybody. All right? And we need to understand that too. That even us as disciples, we'll talk about this next week, us as non-Jewish disciples from the nations, disciples of Yeshua, we are accountable to certain things that other people are not. It's not a one-glove-fits-all thing in the economy of God. It's not a one-glove-fits thing in any society or a family or an organization. It doesn't work like that. There's always a differentiated obligation in any decent organization because of the different roles and the stations that we have. Okay? Why is this all important? Well, ask me that afterwards if you still need it. Let's move on and finish because of time. Okay? So let's look at this. Let's look at the key to understanding differentiated obligation is very, very simple. One, when we're reading the Bible, context when we're reading it. Where are we? Who's being spoken to? And let's just simply let the Torah speak on its own terms. Just like I would let my own contract speak on its own terms. Okay? So let's look at some examples of this. We're just going to go through some slides and we're going to see some passages that highlight and emphasize what we're looking at right now. So in Malachi chapter 4, verse 4, prophet of Israel, Malachi says this. He says, remember the law of Moses. Yeah? My servant, this is Malachi saying this to the Jews in Israel. Remember the law of Moses, my servant, even the statutes and ordinances which I commanded him in Horeb for who? For all Israel. For all the nations? For all Israel. Okay? Leviticus 11 verse 2. Speak to who? Right. Saying, these are the creatures which you may eat from. All the animals that are on the earth. Look at the contrast of the one we looked at earlier. Genesis 9 verse 1 to 3. And God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, every moving thing that is alive shall be food for you. I give all to you as I gave the green plant. So notice to Noah and his sons, God says, you can eat any of the animals. Any of the animals, it's fine. Okay? Eat any of the animals. All right? But just be careful in the manner in which you eat it. All right? Don't tear a limb off it. I know it says not to eat with blood in it, but that's not how the rabbis interpreted it, and I can't get into that intricacy and complexity today, but the understanding is, if you're going to eat from animals, be ethical as to how you do. Yeah, don't just chop off their leg from a cow and yam it and let the thing stay there with its 3 legs. That's the understanding that they have. That's what they believe, So, and notice how that would change the meat industry already over here. Vegans have already caught on to this with their own funny ideologies, but we're talking the same thing. Like, I've seen some of the stuff, like the way that the whole, because of the mass produce, the way that they go about the treatment of animals in order to provide food is not ethical. We are accountable to this as a country. All right? That has to change. Okay? Maybe I hope we can have some part in that here at Eponymous and help other communities and disciples for that cause. Okay? God cares about his creatures. Anyway, but do you see the difference between Leviticus 11 verse 2 and Genesis 9 verse 1 to 3, where God says to the sons of Israel, these are the animals you may eat from, and whereas in Genesis, God says, all that is alive and that moves you can eat. Yeah? That's the understanding. Particular information to the sons of Israel. All right? That's specific to them. You can't eat from these. You can eat from this. All right? Whereas for the descendants of Noah, in general, you can eat what you like, so to speak. That make some sense? Okay. And this is the thing. Oh, goodness. So much to do and learn. Now, food is a moral subject. I didn't hear that a lot in the Christian faith, but what you eat is a moral choice. It's a matter of righteousness and sin. God has instruction. The first commandment in the Bible was about food. Don't eat. So don't ever let anybody down because of Christian theology, God has nullified, through Yeshua, the commandments of the Torah. So there's no such thing as commandments about what you eat and you don't eat. Well, even before the Mosaic law, there was already instructions about what you eat and a condition put upon it. You can eat, but keep this in view. Eating food is a moral action. It's a matter of righteousness and sin. There's repentance still for us to play in regards to our food choices. All right? Yeah. All right. Am I making some sense, though, in terms of the distinctions there? All right, let's continue. I know that's very small but I'll try my best to read it out. So Leviticus 12 verse 12 says this: speak to the sons of Israel. Yeah? Saying, when a woman gives birth and bears a male child, then she shall be unclean for 7 days, as in the days of her menstruation she shall be unclean. Who is this to? Sons of Israel. Leviticus 15 verse 2. Speak to the sons of Israel and say to them, when any man has a discharge from his body, his discharge is unclean. Deuteronomy chapter 14 verse 21. Now notice the difference here. Watch. You, sons of Israel, shall not eat anything which dies of itself. All right, so the Jewish nation are required to slaughter their meat. They can't just have meat that's just been killed by another animal, okay, or that has just died of natural causes. And there's reasons why they're not allowed to do that, okay? But they're not allowed to eat meat that just dies naturally, all right? You may give it to the alien who is in your town so that he may eat it, or you may sell it to a foreigner. All right? For you are a holy, distinct people to the Lord your God. So that last one there, God says that to the Jewish people, to the sons of Israel, you can't eat meat that has from an animal that has died of natural causes, okay? That you haven't slaughtered yourself, okay? But you can sell it to the foreigner who's in your country, or to a foreigner wherever. Okay, so is the foreigner allowed to eat it? Yeah. Or are we saying that God is saying give something to them that's going to make them sin? Is that what we're saying? God is like, God, give it to them, let them sin. Is that what God's saying? No. God's saying you can eat, you can't eat it, but someone else can. Is that the same? Is that the same obligation? Does the foreigner have the same obligation to that meat as the Israelite does? Is God going to judge the foreigner because they ate meat that died of natural causes? Would he judge the Jew because they ate meat that died of natural? Yes. And there's a reason why. The reason why is because of their distinct station. So this helps us to understand why there are 600 or so additional commandments, because many of them have the purpose of making them distinct as a nation. If these weren't given, they would have already, there wouldn't be Jewish people today. They would have already assimilated into the countries from hundreds of years ago. Notice when we go around, wherever you go, you see the Jews. You can see them from a mile, all right? Because many of the commandments that they keep, basically by nature, forces them to be separate in some shape or way. So as an example, all right, if you can't eat the same food, because eating is a part of social interaction. If you can't eat the same food as somebody, it changes the dynamic of your social interactions. Doesn't mean you can't eat together or have social interaction, but it does put some boundaries there. Does that make some sense? So because of things like that, a different calendar as well that the Jewish people are given, okay, those things make them distinct and keep them separate so that, for one sense, God can keep a track of where the Jewish people are, who they are, and what they're supposed to do. All right, am I making some sense? All right, but you get in the idea of differentiated obligation. All right, let's continue. All right, now we're going to move on to differentiated obligation within the Jewish nation itself. Okay, so look, then the Lord said to Moses, speak to the who? The sons of Israel? Does it say the sons of Israel there? Speak to the priests, all right? The priests are the sons of who? Aaron. Aaron is from what tribe? The Levites. Does it say speak to the Levites? No. Believe me, there are commandments where it says to the Levites, to the sons of Levi. This is speak to the priest. So this is one specific family within one specific tribe in the Jewish nation. Speak to the priests, the sons of Aaron, and say to them, no one shall defile himself for a dead person among the people, except for his relatives who are nearest to him, his mother and his father and his son and his daughter and his brother, also for his virgin sister who is near to him because she has had no husband, for her he may defile himself. Not getting into this right now, but this is to do with the subject of ritual purity. This is not a sin issue. This is a status issue of what makes you permissible to get into the temple grounds and interact with God's holiness or not. All right, we need to get into that subject as soon as possible. Okay, but the reality is that being around a dead person, a dead body, a corpse, okay, transmits what the Torah refers to as ritual impurity. One becomes in a status of what's called ritually impure, and it means in this status, they're fine. They can go to the synagogue, they can pray, they can do everything. They can read the Torah, they can be a perfectly moral being, but they can't access the temple in that state. They need to go through some process of ritual purification before they can get to the temple. But they can still be very much, it doesn't affect their relationship with God. It just affects their access into a specific venue. But the point is that the priests specifically are told that they are not to just basically allow themselves to become ritually impure through interaction with corpses. The only time they can engage with corpses is if it's their own close relatives, as specified here. So they couldn't attend, for instance, the funeral of everybody and be all close and personal in a funeral. All right? Only for these individuals. Am I making some sense? Okay. And there's a reason for that too, but not getting to that today. But notice the comparison. Leviticus 21 verse 10 to 11, it says the priest who is the highest among his brothers, i.e. the high priest, right, shall not uncover his head, nor tear his clothes, nor shall he approach any dead person, nor defile himself, even for his mother and father. Okay? So even for his parents, he wasn't, and you see this, like there are Jewish people who know themselves to be from the tribe of Levi and from the line of the priestly lineage. So if you was to see them at a funeral, they're far away, outside of the funeral grounds. They're still there observing, but they're not on the premises because they're maintaining a distance to still maintain, as the commandment says, a state of ritual purity. Does that make some sense? But here's the point though. Do you notice the distinction between what's instructed towards the general priests and the high priest? So there's a differentiated obligation even within the priesthood. Okay? Am I making some sense? Let me move on to the next passage. Oh, you put this onto the next page. Thank you. So Deuteronomy 17 verse 16 to 18. This is my penultimate slide. Moreover, he, the king of Israel, we started with this, shall not multiply horses for himself. He shall not multiply wives for himself, so he can't be a polygamist. Nor shall he greatly increase silver and gold for himself. He shall write for himself a copy of this law on a scroll, in the presence of the Levitical priests. This is specific to who? The kings of Israel. So, does it say that the general Israelite can't multiply horses? No. Can they? Of course they can. All right? But could the king of Israel do that? Okay? And there's also a reason for this. Okay? But not getting into that today. But the purpose is to show the differentiated and the distinctive obligations within one community. All right? Am I making some sense? All right, and let me bring up this final slide. Breathe. Applicability. So, some instructions in the Mosaic law are only applicable when there is, one, a functioning Levitical priesthood in operation, which is to say, if there's not a Levitical priesthood in operation, then by necessity, basically by extension, there are several of the Levitical laws, and that governs interaction at the temple and so on. They are not obsolete, but they can't be carried out. Okay? Some instructions are only applicable when there is a functioning Sanhedrin. Have you noticed that Jews don't go around stoning people? Does Judaism teach that the law's abolished? Does Judaism teach that? The Jews teach that, the Torah is abolished. So they keep it, right? If anyone's keeping the Torah, it's the Jews, particularly the Orthodox Jews. Okay? Do they stone their fellow members? No. Why? Isn't there a commandment in there? Isn't that part of the whole death penalty and so on? Isn't there? Yeah, it is. But why? Because they understand something which I'm trying to get across. That those things cannot be done. The capital punishment, all right? Carrying out judicial punishments cannot take place unless there is a functioning Sanhedrin a national Torah court of justice in place. It would be illegal for a Jew to stone another Jew or carry out the death penalty without the proper forms of judicial process and jurisprudence being carried out. That will be a miscarriage of justice. Right? There are several commandments that stipulate how justice is supposed to be carried out within a Torah law of court. Okay? I'm making some sense? All right, so if anyone says to you, oh, you don't stone anybody, well, yeah, because there's no national law court that makes that permissible today. All right, not the argument that, oh, that's still valid. Of course, it's not only is the death penalty still valid for the Jews, it's valid for everybody. One of the reasons why, when the world does get its final judgment, is because of the amount of bloodshed, innocent bloodshed, that has taken place and has not been accounted for. All the way from Abel's day, I can hear the blood of your brother crying out for me. That's that unjust murder of an innocent, righteous, ethical human being. The world will be held accountable. Nations will be held accountable for the fact. Imagine the volume of unjust killings. Just think about what that figure is, and that there's not been a balancing out in terms of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, a life for a life. All right, full compensation, so to speak, for the crime. All right, and finally, some instructions are only applicable inside the land of Israel. Okay, so for instance, if actually, I won't give any for instance. Time is gone. All right, but some instructions are only applicable inside the land of Israel, which means to say, if they're not in the land of Israel, it doesn't apply. It goes. I'm going to give an example. It says, if when your field makes certain produce, you are supposed to take the corners of your field and do certain things with it, which we won't get into today. Well, one, if you don't have a field, it doesn't apply to you. Two, if you're not in the land of Israel having a field, it doesn't apply to you. Okay? And Jews know this now. All right? Which means, yes, we have to relook at tithing. Because our whole concept of tithing is based on a replacement theological model of the church replacing Israel. And what we do today is not even what the Mosaic law teaches. And it's not even binding on non-Jews anyway. Okay, I hope this starts to, and now I hope this helps us to understand. We'll move on with this next week. Why this is not, we don't go into these Leviticus and so on and just willy-nilly pick and choose. I don't know how all of a sudden Christianity maintains tithing on the one hand. And then, and then the very next passages, and it doesn't make any sense. Who's supposed to give your tithe? Who's supposed to tithe, actually? Does anybody know? Who was instructed to tithe, to give 10%? It was the Levites. We're supposed to give 10% of what was given from the contributions of Israel. They're supposed to give 10% to the priests. But then this is what church replacement theology does, is that, the pastors are the priests or whatever. So we give, no, they're not. Never. Paul would never call the pastor a priest. They were called what they're called, overseers. That's it. Overseers. Right? We're grafted into the community of Israel, which means there's still the tribes. There are still the Levites. You're not a Levite. We're not a Levite. That is all replacement theology. Get away from that. But then we need to talk about, but our community still needs contributions. And it still needs funds. If you appreciate what's going on here, we need your support. This doesn't pay for itself. Okay? But you will never hear me condemning you, as you hear some pastors doing, for not tithing. Because I know that's incorrect. All right? And there are some great things we can learn from the tithing principle in various different ways and fashion. And there's more than one tithe. Don't even get me started on tithing. Anyway, we are going to revisit that subject. We are going to go through all 613 laws over the next few years. Right, it will take some time. And then, do you know what? Once we've done it, we're going to do it again. And we're going to do it again. All right? And we'll see who's still with us and who's joined us, because I'm pretty sure there will be people who will at that time, and as this continues to build and grow. I am going to leave it there for today. Okay? So that's where we will close.